Hello and welcome back. We are continuing our Django Python series of tutorials, and today we're going to look at unit tests. There are multiple ways to access tests. There's Flask that we talked about prior when we talked about API. It has some test-related stuff, but what we're going to focus on today is the Django test cases and framework essentially that it provides. So we've got something that will work with our models and forms and things that we're building out as part of our application. In order to do so, we're going to start by creating a file that we're going to call tests.py. And when we open it up, we're going to do something very simple to start off. So we're going to, from Django test, we need to import. We're gonna use client in another session. Today we're going to focus on very general, straightforward unit tests. When we get into client, we're going to have another session. We're going to talk about actually going to the using it from the browser point of view. This is more of a definitely more of a back end kind of unit test we're going to focus on today. In a later lesson, we're going to look at doing it from the browser point of view. We also are going to go ahead and import from the database models because we're going to be working with those a little bit. And then from our project, we're going to import our two, we use lookup status and I think task, yes. And we're going to import our two classes that we had over here in our models, lookup status and task. As we're working with those. Now, a concept that we have not really talked about to this point is inheritance. And that is going to come into effect today because we are going to create a class called all tests, and we're going to inherit from test case. We will cover this in more depth at another time. For now, the important thing is that this all test class has properties, has features of a test case class. And that's going to become important as this framework basically executes our tests. Is it knows that because it's a test case, there are some certain things it can look for, some certain formatting and almost stylistic kinds of things that it'll be able to pick up on in order to execute our tests. Now, when we created this file, this tests.py, that is going to be key to be able to run the Django tests. That's what it's looking for. And within that, it's looking for this test case. It's going to build on top of that. Furthermore, any test that we're going to use is going to start with the name test. So we're just going to do them simply right now. So we'll have test one, and because this is a class, every one of them is going to send self in. Now let's start with this. We're going to create a test name variable in the class level. And then we're going to come down, we're going to create our first test. And all we're going to do for this first test is we're going to do, actually let's call this not defined. And then we come in with our first test, we're going to say assert equals, which you will see, which you see, if you've used unit testing frameworks before, you will have seen something like this. Typically what you have is assertions, and those are the tests. So if the assertion is true, then it passes. If it fails, then it fails the test. If the assertion is not true. So our assertion is we're going to say that self.testName is equal to not defined. So if self.testName is equal to not defined, then it will pass. If it is not equal to that, then it will fail. Now we can run these very easily from the manage, and all we have to do is test. Before we do things like run server, things of that nature, we're just going to do test. It's going to go look for that. It's going to run it. And there's something I did not do. Cannot import name lookup status. So let's go look at that again. oh, I'm sorry, dot models. Whoop. Models. So now if I run it. Now, let's look at this real quick. This line right here, creating test database for alias default. When we run this test through Django, it actually is going to go back to our model, or our models, and it's actually going to create a full-blown test database in structure-wise. It's not giving us data, but it's going to give us that structure because it's based off of our models. And it's going to work within that test database. And then when it's done, it's going to destroy it. So we have built in, when we use the Django methods, we have a way to actually spin up an entire test database that's pristine, put a lot of stuff into it, do a lot of work, do testing based on it, and then it all gets cleaned up. We don't have to worry about messing up or putting junk data or even test data into our even our development database. This gives us a clean slate as we build out our database, as we build out our tests. Now you can see here that it ran one test and there's no issues. And it says at the end, it just says, okay, so I ran through all the tests, no big deal. Now what happens if we change this so that it's going to fail? Let's look at that. Creates database again. This time it fails. It ran one test. It failed instead of okay, there's one failure. And here is the information we get for the failures. So test one failed. It gives us a little bit of a trace. And essentially here is where it says we have this assertion error. So we said our assertion was that not defined, or I'm sorry, that the test name was equal to not defined 2. But it says no, actually, we thought it was equal to not defined 2, but it's actually equal to not defined. So we can come in here and we can fix that. So that's the most simple kind of test that you can do. Now, if we wanted to, let's say we wanted to test assigning stuff, then we could come in and we could change that. So we could say self.testName equals to, let's say it's test1. And then let's make sure that it assigned it properly. Test1. So it's going to come in, it's not defined. We're going to assign it and we're going to check it. And when we do that, we're going to see that it comes through and we get an okay at the end. It all tested through. So let's get a little more complicated with this. So test 2, we are going to start working with our models a little bit. So let's do this. Oh, wait, that's a self. Let's create a lookup status. So status equals lookup status. Actually, let's try it. We're going to do a couple. We're going to play with this one a little bit. We're going to look at the models that exist because we have this test database. So the first time we come through is we're going to say, let's call it items, and we're going to do equal to lookup status dot objects, because we're using the model dot all. And now what it should, we should be able to say that items is, I believe it's just going to be, it's going to look like this. It's going to be an empty array because nothing, there are no objects when we start. Let's check that one real quick. Let's verify that. Because even though we've got a database that we can work with, there are no items there. Oh, I'm sorry. It's going to say, so the query sets that. Let's do it simply. Instead of dealing with query sets, we're going to say that the length of items is 0. So there's no records return. If we do that, then that's correct. Now it's running 2 tests. We've got both our tests in there. But now let's go ahead and create status, and it's going to be equal to lookup status and status dot, I think we called it name. Let's say that's going to be equal to complete status dot call it short name is equal to COMP. Status.save. So now we're saving it to the database. So now when we do that again, so we're going to go pull it and we're going to be able to prove that now we're going to verify that now this item is in there. What's it complaining about? Okay, nothing that matters. So we're going to come in, we're going to prove that we're going to assert, validate there's nothing in there. We're going to create a record, we're going to save it, and then we're going to make sure that there is a record within there. And this would be sort of a common kind of thing we'd want to do, is we want to test creation, deletion, things like that. So bam, test works. Now let's create a second one, just because. And this will be cancel. And so now, when we do that, there should be 2 items in it. And then, let's get really fun with this. Now we are going to get where short name equals COMP. And we're going to verify that, oh, it's an item now. It's a single item. Item.name better be equal to complete. Now notice this is a key part of our unit test in building them out, is although we know in the database there is a primary key, there's a most likely, since this is a clean database, we have complete is probably going to have a primary key of 1, the ID is probably going to be 1, and cancel is probably going to be ID of 2. And actually we can print that when we get our items. So we can do print item dot ID. So we'll show that. Oh, let's do it this way. Just because, and I think that's an integer, so we'll have to do it this way. Let's just make sure. Okay. So it's going to print that out as part of it. And we'll see that in the output. What we're going to do is we're going to create 2 of them. We're going to get one. We're going to validate that the one we get back is the correct name. And notice that we're basing this off of short name. So we're actually looking it up, not based on the ID, but based on another piece of information that we have. Even though we have our primary keys in our models, this is something we didn't really touch on before, but it is good to have other primary ways, searching methods to get to your records, because you're not, depending on what they are, of course, but generally speaking, you're not going to know what the ID is. So you're going to have to figure out other ways to get to the record without knowing the ID. And it may just be from a list and you select one, but there may be other things. So let's take a look at that test. Let's clear a little space out here. And so we can see here that it ran both tests. They passed. And we can see here item ID was printed out, which is 1. Because that was the first one that came through. We don't have that guaranteed though, so we don't search on ID. So now we've come through and played around with our models a little bit. Now another thing that we can do is that there is a setup that you are allowed to do. This is something that, this is because this is a test case. When it runs, the Django system runs a test, it's going to look for a setup. And what a setup is it allows us to do some things. For example, we can come in here, and let's get rid of this. Let me change that test around a little bit. And we're going to actually come in now, and we're going to, as part of our setup, we're going to create 2 records. So now this, we're going to do this, and we'll do it this way. Okay, so now there's 2 things we're going to do. I want to show that with each of these tests, this is actually going to run each time. We're going to play around a little bit to do so. Well, let's do it this way. So this is going to run, this setup runs each time. It's going to create our 2 records, and it basically gives us a clean slate for each test. So let's create a test 3. And here we're going to come in. So test 2, let's do this. We're going to actually change the name to be completed, and we'll verify that. And we're going to save it. And now we're going to come in test 3. We're basically going to do the same thing. And here we're going to get it by short name. And we're going to verify that it's actually still complete, even though it ran here. So we come in and we're going to create these 2 records every time as our statuses. We are going to, in test 2, and these run essentially in order, I think, as we've seen. Let's do this. Just to be clear, we're going to show when these run. So we test 1, test 2, and test 3. And I think there's a way that we can do this. I'm not going to deal with it right now, but there's other ways to, I think, do a verbose and see what tests are being executed. For now, we're going to keep it simple. So what we're going to do is test 1 is just a very simple one we've done. Test 2, we're going to come in and we're going to change the name of one of our statuses. Test 3, we're going to show that that status name change is only within the scope of test 2. So let's take a look. Let's see if that works like we think it is. It did not print. Why did I not do that? Interesting, it did not print for me. But it did do my 3 tests. It doesn't show which order they're running in. That's a shame. Why didn't they? That's a good question. Good question, Rob. So we'll deal with that at another point. Let me take a look at that. Oh, there it is. Okay, I'm not going to save it. It doesn't work when you don't save the file. Okay, so you can see here it did run them in order: test 1, or our numbered order, test 1, 2, and 3. And we can see that although we changed the name here, we get a fresh setup with test 3. So this allows us to do a lot of complicated things if we want to within any given test, either a given test, or we could actually have multiple basically test classes that we work with. And we could have a completely different set of data that is our setup that we work with in each case. So that gives us some pretty powerful stuff we can do right off the bat as far as validating our models and how they work. And we can go within these models. We can do things like since we can add functions to our models, we could easily test any of those. We also can test, for example, our utilities. If we wanted to import this file, we could run these and see if they actually come out the way we expect them to. The tests we did before, we weren't returning values, so those weren't terribly interesting. However, we can also test things within our views. But the better way to test views is actually going to be as a request, and that is what we're going to talk about the next time around when we use the client. So that does it for today. Hope you had a good time. Hope you learned a few things about testing. Feel free to play around with those. Check it out out at Git. You can see it in the show notes. You can see it this will be tagged for class 23. And you can see this script out there. But as always, go out there, have yourself a great day, and we will talk to you next time.